Drawing lots. One evening, my father came home from the pier after a hard day's work repairing fishing nets and keeping the Kennedy seaworthy. After dinner, he gathered us children and scattered 7 pieces of folded paper on the table. "There are 7 of you," he said, "and I cannot afford to put you all through school and university." Then he had Katarina, the youngest of us, draw 1 piece of paper. Lampudesa had its own middle school, but no liceo, or high school. Sending your children away to a liceo in Sicily was a luxury few could afford. The drawing of lots, however, was entirely for show. My name was on all 7 of those pieces of paper. After all, I was the one who was about to finish middle school, and my grades were excellent. But mainly, I was the only boy in the house, and so if anything ever happened to my father, I would have been responsible for my mother, my sisters, and my brother. I cried myself to sleep that night. I was 13, and the idea of leaving my family and living far away terrified me. The next morning, I told my mother how I felt. "Mama, I don't want to go. I'm scared." She hugged me tightly and made the same face she had every time she came home from Agrigento after visiting my brother at the mental asylum. She was heartbroken. She did not want to lose me too. I heard her arguing with my father, but he convinced her in no time at all. "Tu voi ci sini staka pi fare u pescatori como a mia? Cis tu voi pi tu to figlio." "You want him to stay here and end up fishing for a living like me," he said. "That's what you want for your son?" My father was adamant that he did not want me to lead the life he himself had led, at the mercy of a fitful sea that could be gentle at one moment and vicious the next. He had higher hopes for me, and this was not unusual for the era. We were at a turning point in Italian history. Post-war reconstruction and the economic boom had led ordinary people all over the country, workers, farmers, fishermen, to aspire to a better future for their children. It no longer seemed impossible to them to have a child attend university and become a doctor, lawyer, engineer, or teacher, in part because the government was now offering them encouragement and support. We all thought our democracy had finally gained a firm, solid, almost indestructible foundation. My father was convinced that any obstacle could be overcome, if only I was willing to put in the work. I left the following autumn with a suitcase containing the few clothes I possessed and little else. It had been decided that I would be sent to Trapani, because there was a direct flight to there from Lampudesa. I would attend a Liceo Scientifico, a school that focused on the natural sciences. My father rented a room for me in a house belonging to an old lady. The first few days were terrible. My landlady was cold and gruff, and could not have cared less that I was scarcely more than a child. She never smiled, hugged me, or said a kind word to me. The house was dark and gloomy. It was so damp that the walls were peeling. I would come home from school, throw myself on the bed, and sob. I was disconsolate. And when evening came and I was completely alone with nothing to do, I only grew lonelier. I couldn't stop thinking of my mother, my father, and all my sisters sitting together around the table. What is more, I was incapable of cooking or taking care of myself. In a family with 6 women, it had been out of the question at home for me to even touch a pot or pan. I ate nothing but bread and canned meat for months. To this day, the sight of spam in the supermarket turns my stomach. Slowly, I learned to cobble together a few simple ingredients and make a plate of pasta, but I was still very homesick. Frankly, I thought it ridiculous that I had to stay there, all alone in the unfamiliar city. Every day was the same monotonous routine, traipsing back and forth between my bedroom and the classroom. When I saw families in the street on Sundays walking along together and laughing happily, I would feel a lump rise in my throat. All I did was study hard and dream of the day when I could go back to Lampudesa. This may seem odd, but although Trapani is a coastal city, I missed my sea. Only people who know Lampudesa will understand why it just isn't the same. I missed the island's flat landscape and its unbreakable bond with the waves. I missed spending the whole days outside with my friends, running around barefoot and amusing ourselves with improvised games. It wasn't much, but it made me happy. After a couple of years, my father found me a room with a family instead. The head of the household, whom I called Uncle or Uzu Nana, was a street hawker. He and his wife treated me much better than the old lady had. The entrance to their home was a garage in which Uzu Nana kept his donkey and cart. Early in the morning, he would take his cart to a place called the Senia, a vegetable plot where all kinds of fruit and vegetables were grown. He would fill up his cart and spend his days peddling produce on the streets of Trapani. Since I woke early, I often went with him to help him fill his baskets before school. I didn't mind the chore at all. In fact, I was grateful to be given something to do. Every now and again, Uzu Nana would take me to the tuna fishery by the harbor in Bonagia to watch the fishermen kill their catch. In their instinctive search for warmer water, gigantic tuna were lured through an ingenious system of pipes until they unwittingly swam straight into the death chamber. There, powerfully built men were standing by with long hooks, riling each other with age-old slaughtering songs known as Sioleme, and guided by the most experienced fishermen or rais. As the tuna resurfaced, they would snare them and with an immense effort heave them out of the water. That epic battle between man and beast made a strong impression on me. I remember how the blood stained the water deep red as the fishermen labored to exhaustion. It was formidable and exhilarating to see. It was around that time that I made my only friend in Trapani, Michelangelo. After school, we would gather pine nuts in the forests of Eris. We would shake the trees, prise open the cones, and shell the nuts for drying. Then we would share our considerable harvest. I gave mine to Uzu Nana, who sold them from his cart because collecting them was such a fiddly business. They fetched a high price. That way I had a pastime that helped to support my host family. During my time in Trapani, I even learned to weld. A blacksmith named Tita lived near us, and I often spent my afternoons with him. But I was young and impetuous, and never thought to protect my face with a mask. I would go home at night with eyes so red and swollen that I could not sleep. I spent whole nights with potato slices on my eyelids to relieve the pain. I was keen to learn and curious about everything. Above all, I did not want to leave myself any time to think about where I was. An irrevocable choice. As a child, I always enjoyed hunting. My friends and I used to talk skylarks, fashioning slingshots out of branches stripped from trees. Choosing the right branch was crucial, since the wood had to be strong and supple but not snap. The older children would pass down the secret art of slingshot making to the younger ones, and the tradition lives on to this day. We children had to entertain ourselves with games of our own invention, and this one was a firm favorite. One of the biggest industries in Lampudesa was that of the dried fish delicacy known as pishishishi. The fish would first be submerged in large vats of a particular kind of brine. Then they were stacked head to tail on gigantic wooden frames and left out to dry in the field where the airport now stands. We called it the airfield, even though back then it was only the military aircraft that ever landed there. Each morning the workers would line up thousands of drying frames until they filled the entire dirt field. They looked magnificent then, like a mighty river, silver and glistening in the sun. In the evenings, the workers would put away the frames again to protect them from the dew overnight. It took 5 or 6 months to produce a batch of pisci, which would be sold in Sicily. It sounds straightforward, but it was a grueling job. Seagulls would swoop in, attracted by the scent of the fish, and the workers would spend all day chasing the birds away. Another threat to the pisci workers was us children, especially when we were on the hunt for skylark nests. The skylarks were elusive, but we had worked out a way to locate them. We would study the sky to spot the females, who circle above their nests to defend their young. That way we knew exactly where to look. The nests were often in the pisci field itself, so when the workers were distracted, we would sneak in and wreak havoc, hoisting up the frames in search of our prey. In retrospect, I fear we were a far greater nuisance to them than the dreaded gulls. On returning to the island as a doctor, I graduated to shooting. I would regularly go out and target migrating birds as they stopped to rest from their long flight across the sky. But one day, when my friends and I were out with our guns, I decided to give it up. In a single instant, for what might seem inconsequential reasons, I lost my taste for it as I took aim and looked up at the multitude fluttering in a wave-shaped formation overhead. I thought about the long way these birds had come and the long way they had ahead of them. In that moment, it was as if I could see in the flock the faces of other migrants, people who are willing to brave all kinds of dangers on their path to safety and who are losing spouses, children, and siblings for the sake of their homing flight. From that point on, I never shot at a bird again. Instead, every time I was asked to give out a hunting license, which was one of my responsibilities at the clinic, I ended up attempting to talk the applicant out of wanting one. There is hardly anyone on Lampedusa who does not remember the shipwreck of October 3rd, 2013, in which 368 victims died. Their coffins were all lined up in the hangar at the airport. They had perished only yards away from the beach, safety, and the chance to start a new life. But few of us remember the shipwreck that happened only a few days later on October 11th. Although just as many people drowned, that disaster was less memorable to most because it occurred further away, off the coast of Malta. That day, a Maltese helicopter dropped off 9 survivors on Lampedusa. The clinic looked like a field hospital in wartime. Some of the patients were lying in bed while others sat in wheelchairs, draped in blankets with drips attached to them. One man was the only person in a family of 22 to have survived. He was howling that he wanted to kill himself. We persuaded him to sit and calmed him down. A young Syrian man was hooked up to a drip. His face was blank. I tried to talk to him, but he would not respond. The woman who sat next to him was cradling a 9-month-old child in her arms. She too was staring straight ahead with glazed eyes. She was cradling her baby in a strange way, alternately clasping him to her and holding him away. After an hour or so, the man decided to speak to me. He explained that the woman was his wife. When the boat was wrecked, they had thrown into the water along with 800 other passengers. He was an excellent swimmer and was carrying the 9-month-old at his breast. He held his wife's hand with one hand and clasped his 3-year-olds in the other. They started swimming side by side, treading water continuously and trying desperately to stay afloat. They waited for help, but none came. They were exhausted. At a certain point, the man realized that he was running out of breath while the waves were getting higher and the current stronger. He had an irrevocable choice to make. Right then, suspended between life and death, he had to weigh his options and make a decision. If he just kept treading water, all 4 of them would drown. In the end, he opened his right hand and let go of his son. He watched him disappear forever under the waves. As he told me this, he could not stop weeping, and nor could I. I did not have it in me to hold myself together. I felt guilty, since a doctor is not supposed to let his patient see that he is overwhelmed, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't just remain impassive in the face of such grief. The man was tormented by the fact that only a few moments later, the helicopters arrived. If I had held out just a little bit longer, my son would be here with us. I will never forgive myself. Another woman had a 2-year-old in her arms. The little girl was making a gurgling sound. Drun, drun. The mother explained that her daughter was thirsty, but that she vomited each time she was given water. We had difficulty inserting a drip, but at least we succeeded. The woman told us that her husband had stayed behind in Libya. They could not afford to pay the fare for all 3 of them at once, so they decided that she and the child would go on ahead. They had not heard from him since. Among the survivors was a university student who told us that a woman had gone into labor during the journey. They had asked whether there was a doctor on board. As it happened, there were 7, and they all assisted with the birth. Immediately afterward, the boat capsized. Perhaps he said it was because so many people jostled to see the newborn that the vessel keeled over. The following morning, a Guardia de Finanza boat came to port in Lampedusa. Instead of survivors this time, it brought us 21 dead bodies, lined up as usual in green body bags along Favo Lora Pier. Before making the first dissection, I spent some time looking at the victims and summoning up the courage to begin. Among them were 4 children who looked as if they were asleep. Performing any post-mortem is hard, but examining the corpse of a child is devastating. I went home even more despondent than I had been the day before. For a long time, that shipwreck went on delivering up bodies. They were not just numbers. These bodies represented the stories of families who had lost their children. Even though those children left home precisely to escape the war at home and avoid that fate, it was as if unscrupulous huntsmen were shooting in the dark at random, straight into the thrashing multitude of the migrants. The following week, I received a telephone call from a Syrian man who spoke excellent Italian. He had tracked me down after first calling all the other Bartalos on Lampedusa. He asked whether I found his brother among either the victims or the survivors of the wreck. His brother had been on board with his wife and their 4 children. He was a doctor who ran his own clinic together with 6 colleagues. They had all escaped together from Syria to Libya. Before boarding the same boat, 7 doctors, I thought, they must have been the ones the student had told me about. Several days later, the man sent me photographs of his brother, the sister-in-law, and the children. I recognized his niece. She was one of the 4 little ones in those body bags. I called Porto, Embodocle, and Malta to see if any of the others had survived. The answer was always the same.